Hello and welcome to XYZ News at 10. The headline story tonight is that the ancient world itself is on trial for the crime of going against the law. But aren't all crimes against the law, you ask? Yes, well, this is worse. It's against the law, L-O-R-E. Judge Flo asked in her opening statement, "Why is everything we thought we knew about you wrong? Can we trust anything we hear? Did Julius Caesar invent Caesar salad, or was that just another lie?" Today, 3 expert witnesses will be called to the stand to provide evidence on the truth of ancient history. Barney will be giving evidence on the ancient Near East, Meg on ancient Greece, and Xenia on all things ancient Rome. We'll be back later with more news from what some are calling the trial of the century. For now, the weather.
So crime is actually one of my passions. I'm definitely a crime podcast listener, but I am absolutely so pumped for today's topic. And I want to hear all the gory details. I want to hear about the punishments. I want to hear about the judges, the juries, the executioners. Actually, is there such a thing as an ancient executioner? Was capital punishment a thing back in the day?
Yes. I would say, Flo, that yes, capital punishment did exist in the ancient world, across the ancient world, in the sense that there were a lot more actions that were punishable by death.
Oh, like what? Because I always think this about, I have a fantasy that I might go back in time accidentally, and I wonder how far back I could go and not be murdered for just existing. So I wonder, like, is there such a thing in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, that if I insulted someone's goat, that's like a murdering offence, but if I stabbed someone for some coins, then it would be like, what? You've been naughty, but you'll get away with it this time.
I'm not sure about insulting someone's goat. I think an interesting thing about thinking about crime and punishment in the ancient world is that the severity of the punishment often shows how much the particular civilization or culture values that object or victim or whatever. So in the case of Mesopotamia, like, they were big on law codes. It's a bit like case law, where they would have a precedent and they would say, if X happens, then Y will happen. So the situations are very specific. But yeah, farm animals do crop up in these law codes. The most famous of them is the laws of Hammurabi, which I think I've talked about in the past on the podcast. These are from about 1800 BC. And I think the context we talked about it before was if a vet or a doctor damages someone's animal when he's operating on it, then he's liable to pay the money for the animal. You have this eye for an eye type situation, by which if you damage someone's property, you have to replace it kind for kind, which has a Latin name, lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Is that right, Xenia or Meg?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct.
It's a bit stressful if you're operating on someone's granny. How do I replace this granny, you know? You have mentioned before, Barney, about those laws being very if X, then Y. If you do this, then this will occur. I find that quite comforting. I quite like rules.
Well, I guess it seems that if something's not covered in the scope of those laws that have been set out, and, you know, in the laws of Hammurabi, there was just under 300. So you can imagine if you were a particularly enterprising criminal, you might be able to start committing crimes that they hadn't even anticipated.
No one has ever ridden a lion into a bank, demanded every second coin in the safe, and then left while yodeling. So we can't actually punish you. Have a nice day. Bye.
It's like a sort of Guinness World Records for crime. Like the first person ever to do what Flo just described.
I hate to be the scribe who had to write these all down, and just as people keep committing more and more novel crimes, you're having to keep going over your previous inscription on the tablet. But in terms of what they kind of valued and what was severely punishable, or at least what's prominent in the law codes, Hammurabi's code has a couple of laws about irrigation. You know, I'm always down to talk about irrigation in ancient Mesopotamia. And so if you were poorly keeping the banks of your irrigation ditch, so that your field could get water from a river, and the ditch or the bank broke and flooded someone else's river, you would have to replace all of their crops.
I think that's fair, isn't it, if you destroy someone else's crops?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a clear sense of like community responsibility, but it's individual responsibility as well. And I'm sure there's situations where, you know, the individual might not be able to afford to pay the punishment, and that would presumably lead to other problems as well.
That was a big problem in early Greece, is that people would get into loads of debt. And if you got into too much debt, you'd actually become a slave to the person that you owed the money or the property or whatever to. So there were all these debt slaves. And that's why this guy called Solon, who was a kind of really famous ancient Greek lawgiver, did like a massive legal reform. It was called the seisachtheia, which literally means like the shaking off of burdens, because he cancelled everyone's debt and made sure that there was a maximum amount of property that people could own, so that you couldn't get these people becoming like having masses of control and other people just constantly being in debt to them. And I think that's really cool that he shook off everyone's burdens. I think they should do it with student loans.
Was just going to say the exact same thing. If there's any sort of rich philanthropist who's like to pay off my loans / rent, I realise now that I'm actually just looking for a sugar daddy, aren't I?
Yeah, well, again, the precedent's there. Solon would shake off your loans for you.
So am I right in thinking that when we consider something really not acceptable and like too oppressive and we call it draconian, was there ever a draconian law?
Yes. So the guy I just mentioned, Solon, was in the 6th century BC, and he, as I just said, he did this seisachtheia where he kind of got rid of all the debt and changed all the laws. And what he was changing was the draconian law, which was from a guy called Draco in the 7th century BC, so like a kind of 100 years earlier, had set up the first written laws of Athens. That's where we get the word draconian, meaning too harsh, as you say, Flo, because they were just ridiculously harsh. Draco was just like the death penalty for absolutely everything, which, as you can imagine, led to some issues. So Solon reformed those laws and said that, okay, well, if someone does something like stealing an apple from your garden, we're not going to put them to death. We're going to come up with a punishment more appropriate to the crime. And the only things he didn't reform were the homicide laws. So Draco's homicide laws, which said that if you kill someone, you might get the death penalty. Solon kept those.
So in Roman law, punishments were differentiated by class. We've mentioned before that the Roman society was very, very classist. And, while in theory there was one punishment for one crime, actually in practice, if you were wealthy and you committed a crime, usually that resulted in exile. But if you were of a lower class and then committed a crime, that would usually result in much more severe punishments, like capital punishment, which means losing your life, from caput meaning head, or it would be corporal punishment, from corpora meaning body. So that would be things like, being whipped or having parts of your body cut off.
I can tell you one group of people from the ancient Near East who would have loved that sort of mutilation. That was our friends, the Assyrians. The listeners might have picked up that the Assyrians were a pretty bloodthirsty bunch. I think Salima Ikram drew attention to that a few weeks ago. But yes, the Middle Assyrian laws are very draconian. So we're comparing with the laws of Hammurabi before. The amount of impaling that was going on under the Middle Assyrians was pretty wild. So this is about 1100 BC when this law code was found. And a lot of it is around kind of sexuality and lust. And there's a lot of policing and regulation around women, basically, which is quite shocking, I think. And so if a man, for example, if a man catches a man with his wife, he's allowed to put both of them to death by his own hands. Even more shocking, if a woman intentionally brings on a miscarriage when she's pregnant, she's allowed to be impaled. The city would impale her.
Oh my God.
Yo.
It's really intense. And so elsewhere in the laws, women have to be veiled, which is very rare in the ancient Near East. Not something that we associate with that time period. And certain classes of women, like prostitutes, aren't allowed to be veiled, which shows that they thought of non-prostitute and prostitute women as like very different in a class sense, I suppose. So these are incredibly brutal punishments and highly regulated sort of expressions of sexuality. And it was a strange blip in the history of ancient Near Eastern law codes that still really shocking today.
The thing you just said there about if a man finds his wife, was it having an affair? Yeah, there's a similar thing in Greece, actually, that there was a special court called the Delphinians. There are different law courts in Athens for different types of crimes. So there's a special one called the Delphinion, where you can be tried if you've killed someone and you've admitted that you've killed them, but you're saying it's lawful in some way. And Aristotle gives 3 examples of what kind of lawful killing that might be. And one of them is if you mistake their identity in war. Sort of killing in war generally is absolutely fine. So I'm presuming that's if it's someone on your own side and you've mistaken their identity. If you kill them in an athletic competition, which I don't think is lawful, but fair enough. Or if you find someone sleeping with your wife, you can kill them lawfully. So that's really interesting that there's that parallel.
There was a similar thing that happened under the Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor. He did this big moral reform, it was called. He introduced 2 laws. They also seemed to categorize women according to different classes and also, according to sexual practices as well. So, for example, they restricted adultery. They made adultery a public crime, whereas before that was dealt with privately. And they also put time limits on when a woman could or when a woman had to remarry after having been widowed or divorced. And they also classified sex into 2 different possible things that you could do. There was sort of marital sex or legitimate sex, and then there was stuprum, which was sex with slaves or prostitutes. So yeah, we've got this kind of classification and restriction of women.
It's really interesting that I say it's really interesting. It's really predictable that once again in the ancient world, women get the short straw. But were there any predominant women in law, in juries, in judges, or in lawmakers?
I do have one example from Roman times. So she wasn't actually a lawyer or an orator. So women in general just didn't or couldn't hold public positions. But Hortensia stood up in the forum, and everyone kind of knew who she was because she was from this very wealthy Roman family and her dad had been really, really famous. So there was a tax in the late Republic, so this is the 1st century BC. There was a group of men called a triumvirate, a group of 3 men who decided to claim power between them. And this was actually the second time it had happened, so it was the second triumvirate. They wanted to wage a whole load of wars, so they imposed a tax on wealthy women in Rome. There were 1,400 women in Rome who would have qualified for this additional tax. And Hortensia was appalled by this. So she goes into the forum and she delivers this whole speech saying, well, as women, we don't have a say in these wars that you decide to go and wage. We haven't been involved in the politics behind it. So we don't want to be taxed, as punishment for wars that we haven't helped to create. And sometimes it's called the first no taxation without representation speech. But she wasn't actually asking for representation, just to be clear. She didn't say, OK, you can tax us if we can be in the Senate, because the idea of women being in political positions of power, I mean, it was just impossible. So, yeah, she's not asking for representation, but she is asking for no taxation. And her speech actually made them change the law. So that they just changed the qualifications so that actually only 400 women, as opposed to 1,400 women, qualified for this tax.
Sounds like sort of early lobbying.
So Hortensia would have probably been upper middle class.
Yeah, she was upper class. So as I've mentioned, we've got different punishments for different classes in ancient Rome, but also just in terms of the kinds of crimes that they legislated about in ancient Rome, like senatorial level crimes, whether you were embezzling something or whether you were involved in sort of mafia level stuff. That's what they really cared about. Any crimes against institutions as a rule. So like crimes against things that could affect the running of the state. They didn't care so much about street crime, like basic sort of theft, harassment. I guess the other place that we get lots of evidence of sort of street level crime was curse tablets. So we've got lots of curse tablets saying things like, how dare you steal my cloak while I was having a bath? I hope that so and so smites you down. That's a lot of like justice that they're calling on from the gods when the legal system fails them.
That's really similar in ancient Greece, actually. That kind of, as we talked about before, like religion just plays such a huge part of it, and the idea that there's the legal system, but then there's also the curse tablets, also a thing, and kind of general. If you do something bad, the gods will punish you. But interestingly, in Greece, it's really linked into the actual legal system. So there's this concept of pollution or miasma. Which is basically the idea that crime, and especially murder, sort of homicide, pollutes you, and that pollution can be infectious. So everyone in the ancient Greek world is sort of obsessed with making sure that crimes that are committed are punished, and that the people are either put to death or banished, so that pollution doesn't kind of infect the city. So they go to sort of extreme lengths to do this, including putting inanimate objects on trial.
Hold up. So like, A large loaf of stale bread falls off a shelf, hits someone in the head, and it kills them instantly. And then the bread is put on trial.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
No! What?
So it's because of this idea of pollution that if, for example, a piece of bread is flung at you and you die, they don't know who did the flinging. They don't know if anyone threw it in the first place. It could have just, I don't know, a gust of wind. But they need to make sure that someone has been punished for this murder, because otherwise the pollution will kind of seep into the city and it's infectious and it'll get everywhere. So the piece of bread in that example would be taken to, in Athens, there was a special law court called the Prytaneion, where you'd be tried, one would be tried if one were an inanimate object. And they would have a trial and the piece of bread would be pronounced guilty, and then it would be kind of ceremoniously removed from Athens, and that would put a stop to the pollution.
I've got a crime that might involve some bread.
Oh, yeah. Give me more bread crimes.
Well, it's not a crime that specifically involves bread, but it could involve bread, if you see what I mean. And this is also an interesting class-based one, because it's a crime that sort of operates at the intersection of the royal and the common, should we say, in ancient Egypt, where at various times in their history, they had pretty serious problems with tomb robbing, but not just anyone's tomb robbing the tombs of the pharaohs.
Is that where the curse of the pharaohs comes from? Is that to warn against tomb robbing?
Well, curses do exist in Egypt in the similar sense that you described of, maybe cursing another person with an inscription or something like that. But generally in tombs, there were kind of wards, messages that would try and ward people off, but that's more for the protection of the dead and on their journey into the afterlife than, striking people down. This was a product of the when Tutankhamun was dug up, actually, that people began to think that disturbing a pharaoh would cause you to be struck down, but that isn't something that existed within ancient Egypt itself. But nonetheless, the punishments for robbing a pharaoh's tomb were pretty severe, and so in the New Kingdom, which is the time of Tutankhamun and all the Ramesses, there was a lot of Ramesses towards the end of this period. Ramesses the Great is Ramesses II, but there were actually 11 Ramesses.
Rammed with Ramesses.
It was rammed full of Ramesses, exactly. And this was the 20th dynasty of ancient Egypt. And under these Ramesses, who had increasingly short reigns as the power of the pharaohs began to dwindle, people started to get more and more opportunistic with their crimes. And so under Ramesses IX, people began robbing the tombs of these pharaohs. And really, they'd be after jewels and gold and stuff like that, because, the pharaohs were absolutely the wealthiest people in the land. And then they put a lot of their wealth underground with them for the afterlife. But they would also, in other tombs, they'd rob things like bread and beer that were left, because, they had to feed the dead as well. So some people would just be breaking into smaller tombs just to get at the food offerings. But anyway, these guys under the reign of Ramesses IX, they were punished for robbing the tomb of a pharaoh from a few dynasties before. They were imprisoned, which is interesting, in part of the temple. They were beaten to extract their confessions, and they were ultimately punished with, drum roll please, impalement. Again, they loved a bit of impalement in the ancient world, and that was a really serious punishment. You can tell, like, by the extent of the law coming crashing down on these people, that it was a massively heinous crime to be robbing a pharaoh's grave.
Impalement's pretty shocking, and you did say the Assyrians were quite bloodthirsty, but you haven't seen me scrolling through Spotify trying to find the most gruesome crime podcasts that I can seek out. I want to hear more about these gruesome sentences.
I can talk about crucifixion.
Good Lord.
Ooh.
Yes. Okay, let's go.
So crucifixion was, the most horrible punishment that the Romans could come up with. I think it was actually inspired by some of the Near Eastern practices of impalement. But the idea was for the process of crucifixion to last for as long as possible. Most of the time they weren't actually nailed to the crosses. They were tied to them. Because if you nail someone to the cross, then obviously they're going to lose a lot of blood, and that speeds up the process of dying. So usually they'd just be tied there, and it would be a mixture of the elements and also exhaustion. And actually it would be the lungs that collapsed from the effort of trying to breathe when you're strapped in a really uncomfortable position. So that they prolonged it even further, they would actually put a little shelf for the feet. So you could just about hold yourself up with your feet, but it was very uncomfortable. And most of the time it was your arms holding most of your weight. it was all of these little things that they did to the process of crucifixion that meant that, yeah, it was just really prolonged and really, really horrible. But that was something that could happen to a Roman citizen. Wasn't allowed to be crucified. It was something that could happen mainly to slaves or for non-citizens.
That's like like someone has gone to university to study how to be a sociopath. That's like advanced level suffering. Kind of would like to take back my assertion that I would like to learn more, but tentatively, are there any other punishments that we wouldn't see today?
In ancient Greece, they had, as we mentioned, they did have capital punishment. They did have the death penalty. But because of the thing I was mentioning earlier, the concept of pollution, they were quite cautious with capital punishment, that they didn't want to, in carrying out the sentence of a crime, in sentencing someone to death, they didn't want themselves to then be polluted, if that makes sense. So quite a lot of stuff like people being thrown into a pit, it would be more like it's actually a natural death, but very much caused by us throwing him into this pit kind of thing. Or there's hemlock, which most famously was used to execute Socrates because he was found guilty of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. And that's a very famous trial where he's accused of these things and then is found guilty and has to drink the hemlock.
So I've got a question about miasma and the fact that if you were to banish someone and you'd be in like a random village somewhere and some guy would turn up and you'd be like, oh, hey, howdy neighbour, welcome, this is the village. So what brings you here? And they're like, I can't go back to my place because I done murders. And you're like, cool.
Yeah, and they're like, great, welcome. Bingo night is on Tuesdays. The death penalty would sometimes be used for murderers, and then you wouldn't be being exiled, or you'd be exiled to kind of completely the middle of nowhere, I think. But there is a really interesting thing that, I was talking about there's all these different types of courts. There's one called the Phreato, where you get tried if you've already committed a crime and you're in exile for that crime, but you've been accused of another crime. And then when you come back from exile, the trial takes place on the beach with the accused in a boat, so that they don't bring the pollution back to Athens. They can never step foot on the shore, so they have to do their whole trial in a boat.
I really like that idea.
Same. Just can you imagine just being like seasick and you've been accused of a crime and it's like, did you do these things? No, I didn't. Are you sure about that?
I have a water-based punishment. If you're asking about unusual punishments that don't exist anymore, Flo.
Hit me up. I'm ready.
Okay, so with certain accusations in the ancient Near East, and this one crops up in a number of the law codes, including Hammurabi, and is also in the Middle Assyrian laws that we talked about earlier. One of the punishments would be the river ordeal.
It sounds like it's going to be suffering.
It's a bit reminiscent of how they treated witches during witch hunts.
Dunked like a ginger nut into a lukewarm cup of tea.
Yeah, similarly. As it happens in the old Babylonian laws, in the laws of Hammurabi, if someone accuses somebody else of magic, so a bit like witchcraft, you'd have to go to the river ordeal, which means going down to the sacred river and jumping in. So if you conquer the river and you emerge unscathed, then your accuser is put to death because it's a false accusation. But if the water overcame you and you were swept away and killed, then the accuser was correct and you would be considered guilty of the accusation of magic. Then the person who accused you of magic in the first place gets your house.
What? I mean, that's a real big win or lose serious style, isn't it? That's like a big gamble.
But also, just if you really like someone's house, you could be like, oh, I think I saw them doing something bad, and just hope the river is, dangerous that day.
Or you could play the long con, become a swimming instructor, do a terrible job of teaching your students how to swim, then accuse all of them of crime, then you've got your real estate empire automatically made.
Incredible. Unbelievable. Do you think swimming instructor was a position?
I realise we've talked a couple of times about like ways that you might get around the law or game the system, but like, is there anyone enforcing the laws?
Oh, yes. I've got some police, and I've got an etymology fun fact. The word police comes from the Greek word polis, which means city, which is also where we get words like politics and politicians. And so the Metropolitan Police, the police in London, I will talk about actual ancient police in a minute, but I'm just obsessed with this. The Metropolitan Police, their name is Metro, which comes from Greek mother, and then politan, which comes from polis, and then police, which also comes from polis. So they are the mother city.
That's interesting, but it's also making me think of ice cream. So Neo knew Neapolitan New City flavour ice cream. That kind of is not as tasty as I thought it would be.
That's a Roman and a Greek thing. So that's Neapolitan ice cream is from Naples, and the name Naples comes from Neapolis, new city, which is because the Greeks colonized it. Isn't that right, Meg?
Yeah, exactly. And similarly, stuff like Persepolis means Persian city. So that naming style comes up quite a lot, and the polis is always city. But anyway, sorry, that was a huge digression. There was sort of a police force in ancient Athens. We don't have a huge amount of information about it, but they're called the Scythian or Scythian archers. This is kind of 5th and 4th century BC Athens. And they're from Scythia, which is sort of around Iran, I think. And they were public slaves in Athens and were responsible for sort of keeping public order. And there are about 300 of them. And they could sort of arrest people and beat people up. It's not clear whether they were actually archers, whether they had bows and arrows. They're always depicted with bows and arrows, but the literary evidence suggests it's more likely they just went around sort of beating people up to enforce order rather than being kind of like Robin Hood type guys, which was a bit of a shame. I think that'd be cool. But they wore really cool outfits, according to the vase paintings. They had like wide leg trousers with a cool zigzag pattern and pointy hats. And I really think we should reinstitute that uniform for the police.
The idea that these police are just going around the place just beating people up, like that's law enforcement, that's enforcement of the law, literally.
Yeah, they weren't doing a huge amount of like investigating crimes or doing some DNA evidence. It was mainly beating people up, unfortunately.
There was a similar system in ancient Rome as well. So the fire brigade was also the police force, and they're called the vigiles or vigiles. And again, that was just kind of like a mafia style thing.
So they vigiles because they keep vigil.
Yes, so they keep watch. They watch out for fires, watch out for crime, and that's actually where we get the word vigilante from. Loads of etymology hour here.
It's nice that on police, then we've all got a very similar thing. The police in ancient Egypt, who weren't really a proper like standing police force, but they were kind of hired guards who would keep the peace, are similar to the Scythians that Meg mentioned, are from a non-Egyptian demographic. They were Nubians, especially in the New Kingdom. They kept the peace. They were called a Magi. That was the name. You might recognise that from The Mummy, the Brendan Fraser film. There's a mysterious desert warrior who's a Magi in that. But yeah, so they actually, what Salima mentioned about the police baboon. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
How could we forget?
How could we forget? So they worked with these Nubian police basically, and they had dogs as well as monkeys to help with their arrests. So you'd like sick the monkey on these people and they'd drag them down. And there's a picture of it from an Old Kingdom tomb of a monkey catching a naked thief.
Wow. So they would be like their colleagues. You'd be like, oh, off to work today with my mate.
Like a buddy cop comedy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I want to make that film.
On the topic of these police being thugs and sort of just beating up rather than investigating, I did find that there were some people who were supposed to investigate in late Babylonia. They were called pakudu, and they had to carry out investigations on behalf of the temple court. So if there had been a sort of an accusation about something, you'd send off a pakudu to go and look to see what they could drag up. And so this is later, much later in history, the 6th century BC. And there's one pakudu called Ea Kabani, who was sent to investigate the case of a missing temple cow that had disappeared from a barn. So off goes Ea Kabani, the pakudu, to look, and he found some evidence on his investigation that he brought back to the court, and it was a chunk of beef.
That is so dramatic.
Yeah, so, and on that basis, a decision was made about the outcome of the accusation.
This script is literally writing itself. I'm imagining it. He goes back in. He's like, I found something. He's from America now. Then he like slams the beef down on the table. It'd be so.
Oh, no,
Daisy.
Oh my god! It's literally. I think we need to pitch this. It would be like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but like Babylonia 500 BC.
I absolutely love the drama of this storyline that we're coming up with together because, like Meg said, it's just writing itself. Do we have any other sort of like crazy courtroom dramas?
So, in fact, one of the most famous legal orators in ancient Rome was a guy called Cicero, and he was the absolute master of the courtroom drama. In fact, the case that made his career, that set him on the path to legal and political success, called the case against Verres, a guy called Verres. In Latin, it's known as in verrem. And Verres was the governor of Sicily, and he engaged in all sorts of nefarious activity. There was embezzlement going on. He was involved with a local piracy ring. He used to like commandeer people's artwork and their houses, and he kind of built for himself this crime empire in Sicily. And it was Cicero's job to take him to court. But there were a few legal reforms happening at the time. So courts up until that point were pretty much made up of senators, who most of whom were engaging in similar behaviour, to be honest. So they wouldn't have wanted there to be some sort of like case law precedent for Verres to be convicted. But then, in like a big change of circumstances, another law was passed which actually made the juries much more equal. So it was a balance of senators, upper class people, and equites, middle class people, and then also some lower class representatives as well. And for Cicero, that was like his moment. He really, really needed to push the case forward at that point. And so his tactic, he couldn't really like outpower maneuver Verres, because Verres had all of this political power behind him. He had a whole load of allies in the Senate. But what he could do was just present overwhelming evidence against Verres. So he presents witness after witness after witness, and it's just so overwhelming, and gradually you can just sort of imagine Verres' defense just sort of crumbling in their seats. And he wins the case. That was it for Verres, and Cicero became the big dog in the Senate.
I can personally attest to how much evidence Cicero had against Verres, because I had to study that text for one of my uni exams, and it is long.
Oh gosh, I hope I didn't get any of the details wrong, Meg.
No, or literally all I can remember is just the absolute endless list of like the statues that he'd stolen.
Statues, yes, there's just so many.
So many. And Cicero does this thing in his speeches where he, like variatio, where he'll use different words or different techniques, oratorical techniques to refer to the same thing, which is very cool if you're arguing a case in court. It's not very cool if you're trying to learn it as a university student.
One of my favourite literary techniques, which you sometimes can see used today in politics, is when people say that they're not going to say something, and by saying that, obviously they say it.
Yes. Is it procatalepsis or praeteritio? Is it one of them?
I think it's praeteritio.
Is that like, listen, I'm not saying that Xenia needs to use a stronger deodorant. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying This room is very smelly. For clarity, Xenia's armpits smell absolutely fresh and fruity and fab, so...
The damage has been done, Flo. That is the power of praeteritio. Oh, that was...
I did really love all of those rhetoric words. I think a lot of them sound like failed Transformers characters. I remember one. Scasis Anomaton.
Ooh, what's that?
Scasis Anomaton was the one where there's like two similar words used in a close part of an expression or something like that.
I quite like that all of these words sound like not only Transformers, but also like kind of like a herpes treatment. Do you know what I mean? Like, ask your doctor today about procatalepsis. I mean,
I don't want to be asking your doctor about that one.
No. I've very much enjoyed this episode. It's no surprise because I'm a big crime buff. I know what my favourite thing is that I've learned today, but I'm going to start with you, Xenia. Xenia, what was your favourite thing that you learned today?
Well, I really liked how Barney went against the law on this idea of the Pharaoh's curse, and the fact that started up actually with the uncovering of Tutankhamun's tomb, whereas the punishment for tomb robbery wasn't a curse; it was an actual horrible impalement punishment.
Yeah, that was really interesting, wasn't it? And Barney, I'll ping it back to you. What was your favourite thing that you've learned today?
I really liked Meg's explanations of miasma and this pollution, and that if you were returning from exile, so as to avoid setting foot in Athens, you would have to be tried on a boat. I think that's so extra. I love it.
I've got to say that was my favourite as well. Meg, how about you? What was your favourite thing that you learned today?
Oh, another water-based fact. I really liked Barney's story about the river ordeal. I thought that was really interesting. But my second favourite fact was the story of Hortensia in Rome. I think both of those are very cool, but for different reasons.
Absolutely. So we've heard from all of our defendants now. I hereby declare this case closed, and I sentence all of us to waiting in excitement for our next podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Against the Law. If you can't get enough and are keen for extra content, don't forget to follow us on Twitter @AgainstLaw, and we're on TikTok too. And if you enjoyed this episode, please support us on Patreon. We have different support tiers depending on how much you can spare each month, and each one comes with a special reward to say thank you. We love to hear from you, so please reach out to us with questions or comments on Twitter or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com.